From the absolute bottom of my heart, I want to thank Romnex, the Dark Somnium, and Big Daddy Stone for bringing us this, the second last episode of Duskbowl Season 1. Season 2 of Duskbowl is crowdfunding on Indiegogo. If you want to support it, there'll be a link in the description. Please remember to check out the previous episode in this series, which will also be linked in the description. Now please, enjoy the episode.
(1987). The coffin sat silently at the end of the room, waiting for him.
Please, I can't do this.
Scott thought as he tried to keep his eyes from the pine box's open lid. He focused on his feet instead. Ignorance is bliss. Those words had circled his head throughout the last year, and the whole way through the funeral process. He wished they could apply to him. He wished he didn't have to watch her wither, see her eyes shut, and now, in this cold hall, stare at her painted corpse. But as his son, Joey, stood awkwardly next to him, hands sliding in and out and into his pockets, Scott knew that not knowing was a privilege he could not afford.
How do I stand again? Should I have my hands in my pockets? Should I look like I have my shit together? Or would it look bad if I did? Fuck. How the hell do people do this?
All these thoughts and more whirled around Scott's head.
Damn it.
These muttered words were the first he had said aloud as he felt his eyes burn again, the warning sign of tears.
Be strong for them. Come on, you can do this.
He sucked in his sadness. No tears today. He placed a hand on Joey's shoulder.
You don't have to do this if you don't want to,
he said. Joey was almost a man now. A lanky beanpole of a man, but grown nonetheless. He was wearing the cheap, poorly fitting suit he had bought for his high school formal. That made Scott cringe, but Joey insisted. Scott was more than happy to pay for a rental, but his son had made a point of doing everything off his own back nowadays. And you know what? Scott couldn't have been prouder. Joey said with an almost smile and a poorly hidden crack in his voice.
It's okay, Dad. I can do this. For Mom.
All right.
Scott mustered his courage.
As soon as you're ready, we'll see her.
Joey wiped his eyes with his wrist.
Thanks, Dad.
He could play I'm a grown-up, I swear, as much as he liked. But Scott would lay down on the freeway before letting him go up there alone. But it was just Eve, right? There was no monster waiting in the small pine box. There was just funny, understanding Eve, the queen of sarcasm. Scott tensed. No, he couldn't think that. Otherwise, he'd have to admit she was.
Gone, Scott. Gone.
He continued arguing with the voices in his head.
Admit it to yourself so we can move on. Please, for fuck's sake. She's gone, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Dad?
Joey saw him pause. Scream the hurt away. That's all Scott wanted to do. Weep until he couldn't. All the pain bubbling up inside him, he just wanted it out. But he couldn't. That's what he had told himself. He had to be their rock, be strong for them, as if seeing their father cry would make it worse for them somehow. That was it. He'd let them scream into his chest, pour out their hearts. All the while he'd hold them and tell them it was all going to be okay. But who would do that for him? No one. Because of one simple truth. Daddies aren't supposed to cry. Scott smiled reassuringly.
Just waiting on you. Whenever you're ready.
Joey exhaled his fear and found his resolve.
Okay, let's do this.
The two men started down the long, empty aisle to Eve's coffin. Every fiber of Scott's being was screaming, begging his legs to turn and run. But the dutiful father gritted his teeth and kept in pace with his son. With every step, his chest tightened, and flashes of Eve played in his mind. He wanted so badly to have her hold his head and tell him that she would be home soon.
No tears.
He whispered. Then, sooner than he expected, there they were, standing over the pine box. Scott stared at the ceiling, still unable to look inside. But next to him, Joey's body had stiffened, and the young man was transfixed by the visage of his dead mother. He was always a mommy's boy. Scott lost his wife, but Joey lost his mother. He couldn't begin to understand how hard this was for him. It is an unspoken truth that every child has a favorite parent. Joey was no different. Eve gave that little boy all her love and all her soul. Scott feared her passing would take a piece of Joey with her. A certain softness would be erased from his being, and the world would grow just a bit colder in Scott's eyes. As Joey's scream cried and retreated to his father's chest, Scott knew in his bones that he had hated himself for this, that which was in no way his fault. No use in fear now. Showtime. Scott breathed deep and looked to the face of his wife.
Eve.
They said she would be better, that they would make it look like she was sleeping. But as Scott stared, his stomach twisted into knots. He knew she wasn't. Everyone had said that if he didn't see her one last time, it would weigh on him for the rest of his life. That if he did see her, it would bring the closure he would need to be whole again. But she didn't look like she was sleeping. It looked like her. Her fair skin and her frizzy hair were so delicately placed, but it was like a model of a person. All Scott could see as he stared was an empty house, a fireplace without a flame. It was like a spot reserved for her that she didn't fill. It was a promise that she was gone, and she was never coming back. Scott's face twitched as he tried harder than ever to swallow his sorrow. He tore his eyes from the body and across the vast stretch of empty seats. And there, 2 rows from the back, he saw her, the little girl quietly crossing and uncrossing her feet, too young to understand, impatiently waiting to be told it was her turn. It was in that moment that Scott Campbell made a decision that started his daughter down a path he'd never foresee. But he was fallible, and had only tried, as all parents do, to do what was best for his child.
She won't see,
he said. Joey looked up at him, tears streaming down his face and confusion in his voice.
What?
Scott looked into his son's weeping eyes and was reassured of his choice.
I won't have her see her like this. I just won't.
Why?
Scott turned back to his daughter, little Ashley Campbell, and her innocent eyes.
Ignorance is bliss.
2. Being a parent is fucking hard. There's really no other way to say it. You try to guide and mentor, but oftentimes you'll end up yelling and arguing. It comes from a place of love. Of that, you're certain. But whether or not your kids see that is a different story. A wise man once said, if your children don't hate you, you were never their parent. But as little Ashley Campbell, now 12, sat alone in front of her brother's TV, trying hard to ignore the screaming match in the other room, the idea of hating her dad was the farthest thing from her mind.
She doesn't care about her.
Joey always screamed the loudest. His voice got shrill whenever he made reference to his mom. Joey always screamed the loudest. His voice got shrill whenever he made reference to his mom. It was hard for him. Ash knew that, and Scott knew that too. Emotions are like a liquid, a thick tar-like substance that pours into you. They need to be confronted, resolved. Otherwise, you'll bloat and burst, and then the tar will eat away at your very being.
Of course she cares. She just expresses it differently.
Scott was trying hard to keep his voice low and stern.
You really think so? She never talks about her, never comes to visit. I don't even think she knows what she looks like.
Joey.
I hate her.
Joey.
Scott barked. Ash covered her ears and shut her eyes tightly. "Just don't think about it. Just don't think about it," she said. Was there something wrong with her? Ash hated pain. She didn't know what to do with it. Grief, sorrow, just big words for those feelings that made her eyes water and her insides cold. Big words for big feelings. Too big for little Ash. So, she ran from them, buried them, built a strong box in her head and discarded them there. Down what tears she might have cried. Ash composed herself. Looking to Joey's video shelf, she picked Die Hard and slid it into the VCR.
You coddle her. She's a freak because...
Was the last thing she heard before she turned up the movie's volume. Run from it, she thought. A clock on the wall rattled as Ash heard the dulled sound of the front door slamming. The TV said as John McLean found himself trapped in a vent. The door behind her opened, but she didn't turn to see who was there. Scott wheezed as he began the Herculean task of getting down with his newly brittle bones. He wrapped an arm around her. Father and daughter sitting together on the floor. The only light was that of the TV.
What are we watching?
Ash looked at the video's case again. Die Hard, she said. Ash nestled into Scott's lap as Hans Gruber struggled to track down his American cowboy.
You know, I saw this at the pictures,
Scott said. Ash grunted a response, and her dad let out a long, tired breath.
Chatterbox, I'm sorry you had to hear that. He doesn't mean it, I swear. He's just...
Scott rubbed her back.
Going through some things.
Ash said nothing, pretending as though the subject wasn't brought up. Scott looked around the room. Figurines, video games, movies, and posters. He cocked his head as he thought that Joey really was a pop culture fanatic. This was a guy who could quote Star Trek backwards and give you a detailed history of Eternia. And there was Ash, surrounding herself with it all. Because Joey likes it, was the answer she gave when Scott asked her why specifically Die Hard was chosen. And that was the answer to so many things. Why are you wearing that hoodie? Why are you playing that game? Why are you reading that book? Every time the answer was the same. Because Joey likes it. Ash was one of those kids that played follow the leader. You know the ones. A kid who picks someone in their life and decides from that day on that that's who they want to be. For as long as anyone could remember, Ash dressed like her brother, spoke like her brother, and followed him wherever he went. But whilst Ash looked up to her idol, he looked back and saw only a shadow. And then there was Scott, scared to his core that he had failed as a parent, scared that Ash would grow up as one of those codependent sorts, someone who lives their life entirely by the metric of what others want.
Chatterbox.
Scott called her by the nickname born from his daughter's relative quiet disposition.
Sometimes in life, people aren't going to like you.
Why? Is there something wrong with me? Ash said after a brief pause.
No, and there never will be.
He turned her to face him.
Do you hear me? There never will be.
Ash looked back at the TV. Then why?
Well, people are complicated. We're all different, all have different hopes and beliefs. You can't please everyone, Chatterbox. The world just doesn't work like that.
Ash hugged his knee. So what am I supposed to do? No matter how hard I try, no one ever... She trailed off. Scott couldn't imagine what it was like. He gave his baby girl all the time in the world. Hell, if she asked him for the moon, just like in that old movie, he'd tie a lasso around it and pull it down for her. That, after all, is what a dad is. The man that'd permanently fuck up the planet's tides just to see his daughter smile. But he couldn't control other people. And other people, Ash, seemed to be the problem. Every day she'd shuffle in the door, back from another long, lonely day of school, Scott would get this bittersweet feeling when she'd show off all the drawings she'd made at school when she got home. He'd smile because it was one of the few things she did, only for her. But he'd wince because it meant, again, all her spare time was spent alone in the school library.
12 years old,
he thought, and still no friends to speak of. Well, except for one. I wish you were a kid, Ash said lowly. Scott had some difficulty readjusting, but he bent down and kissed her head.
Hey, are you saying I'm not? For God's sake, woman, I'm barely into my double digits.
He whispered with a smile.
By Jove, the lady doth offend me so.
Like music to Scott's ears, Ash giggled. You're a dork, she said.
Right back at you, chatterbox.
He held her close, hoping that whatever happened down the road, Ash would never put herself down, never think low of herself, and know that, no matter what, he'd always love her.
Right back at you.
3. Radio. It all came down to radio. Becoming an announcer for Sampsonshire's biggest station was something Joey had worked most of his adult life to achieve. Sampsonshire was a big place, and with so many stations all competing for the eardrums of the masses, you had to be cut from a different cloth to survive in the industry. With his gift of the gab, success had come to Joey like water from a tap. When he was on the air, he could have you hanging on his every word, get you pumped for any song, even the top 40 ones, and, on occasion, sprinkle in an endorsement for whatever 2-bit product the higher-ups wanted to sell. But what was he? Really? A painted whore was what he thought. On the air, he'd urge you to trust him, whilst he spewed out whatever script or ad read the bosses wanted him to, justifying it to himself. He thought that at least they paid him for the privilege. His reputation, his nice house, the string of no-name dames and booty shorts. It all came down to radio. It was the winter of 2002, and Joey stood quiet as death as his father explained the doctor's verdict. The condition. It was explained in only a sentence or two. What expectancy could be drawn from this new unseen thing? Then silence. The two men stood awkwardly, both trying to rationalize the fallout, and both dimly aware of the similarities between this and what happened to Eve. Joey might have held his father's hand, might have said, "I love you." He might have done a lot of things differently, if not for the next words out of Scott's mouth.
You can't tell your sister,
he said. Joey felt like someone had pressed a gun against his chest and pulled the trigger. His lips twitched as vicious words barely formed. He balled his fists and stormed into the kitchen, determined to find Ash, to shatter the world of bubble wrap he believed their father wrapped her in. And then he saw it. On the dining table, where there should have been flowers and a fruit bowl, was a small AM radio and a pair of unplugged headphones, and a hairbrush made to look like a microphone. Ash turned into the room, Game Boy in hand, and beamed when she saw her brother. "Joey, hey, it's so good to see you. I heard you on air the other day, and..." Joey turned back to Scott and said with a quiet anger,
What is all this?
He pointed to the dining table. Ash jumped in instead. "It's awesome you're here. Maybe you can give me some tips. I'm going to start at the community station in a few weeks, and Dad's helping me practice talking with confidence and stuff. You know, by pretending we're on air. It was Dad's idea, actually. He's real smart, so basically, we wait for the announcer to start talking, and then we turn him down, and..." Joey glared at his father.
Am I a fucking joke to you?
she just wants to go into radio. It's something she's really passionate about. It has nothing to do with you.
It has everything to do with me. She's a stunted child who never learned to grow a personality because you fucking coddle her.
"That's not true," Ash said. and both men did a double take as meek little Ashley spoke louder than a squeak for once. Joey's face darkened, and for once, he acknowledged his sister.
You're not coddled.
I'm not. He bore down on her, his face inches from hers.
You're not?
He said in a mocking voice.
Joey!
Scott barked. Joey snatched the Game Boy from Ash's hands and tossed it across the room, sending it smashing to the floor.
Those things are for little kids. Grow the hell up.
Scott stormed towards him, but Joey pushed him back.
I'm not done.
He snatched a photo of his mother and pushed it into Ash's face. Ash began to cry and turned her face from the picture. Joey forced her face back and screamed.
Look at her!
I can't! Joey was in her face now. Spittle flew from his mouth and his eyes were wide.
Her name was Eve Campbell. She was a Pisces. Her favorite movie was As Time Goes By. She made pancakes on the weekends. She taught me to ride a bike, play rock, paper, scissors, and...
Ash covered her face and fell in a puddle to the floor. In a fit of rage, Joey hurled the photo across the room and yelled again.
Fucking look at her!
Quiet crept into the disaster zone, and Joey stood limp, drunk with emotion. Scott struggled to his feet and shakily picked up the shattered pieces of Eve's photo. Even now, he refused to cry, still certain he did it for them. He staggered over to his son, who, now, began to realize what he had done.
Dad, I'm...
Scott said evenly and meticulously.
Get out.
Dad,
Now.
Joey left without another word, and Scott helped Ash up onto the couch, where he held her as she cried. 4. The night of the accident was a regular one. That's the way of it, I guess. Life doesn't really ever give you that Hollywood moment. Things just happen. It had been a month or so since the incident with Joey, and it was finally time for Ash to have her first broadcast at the community station. It's all taken care of, she had said. I really think they're going to like me. Scott pulled out all the stops. He had made a slow roast for dinner, and now, as Ash got changed into her idea of business casual, he washed the dishes for dinner. It had been a long road to get here. At first, Ash wasn't even sure she wanted to pursue this. Her dream. You'll just think I'm copying Joey again, she said. Scott had to kick himself then, and still did, forever discrediting what she wanted to do with her life. Sure, her brother was in the industry, but that didn't mean she was forbidden from being interested in it. Joey wasn't the center of the universe. How do I look? Ash said as she clopped out in heels that she barely wore, looking like an early 2000s remix of Grace Kelly.
You look...
He paused as he saw her eye her trusty blue hoodie draped over the couch. Scott clicked his fingers, snapping her eyes back to him.
Over here, Chatterbox. Yes, hello. Fine. You look fine.
She flushed with embarrassment. You don't think it's too much? Scott laughed. She was a jittery, nervous one. It had taken weeks to get a whisper of confidence out of Ash in preparation for tonight. Many hours at their mock-up radio station practicing speech.
Just act natural.
He had told her. Okay, great. But what does that even mean? She asked back. Scott put the last dish to drip dry on the rack and swooped over to the couch and grabbed her hoodie.
All right, I've got it. I'll put it in the car, and you can toss it on when you get out there tonight.
Ash smiled. Thanks, Dad. Sampsonshire was just like any other metropolitan area. Loud cars, louder trains, and dead quiet people. As Ash leaned her head against the passenger side window on the drive up to the station, Scott wondered what must have been going through her head. But more so, if and when he should tell her about the condition. Let your family know and get all of your affairs in order, the doctor had said in a detached, clinical way. Scott shook it from his head. Not yet. He knew she had seen him cough. seen him sway and prop himself up on railings and countertops. But Ash, sweet Ash, as always, turned a blind eye to what she saw. All this time, and her way of coping was still to run away. He hoped he had done right by her. That's all he had tried to do, all he had ever tried to do. And as she sat beside him, now less than an hour from starting the next chapter of her life, Scott knew in his bones, no matter what happened, he was so damn proud of her. When they pulled up to the station, they were met with a shabby building, flanked on both sides by overgrowth. Scott grunted. If they had faces for radio, why shouldn't their workplace? "Hey, Dad," Ash said.
Yeah, what's up?
"Can I borrow your phone?" Was it weird that Ash didn't have her own phone yet? Maybe. Yes, she was an adult, but she was still living at home and had no friends to ring anyway. He handed it over. She thanked him and climbed out of the car, walking a few paces away before he could see her start speaking. Now, in this, one of his briefest moments of solitude, Scott thought about letting just a tiny bit of his sadness out. Decades of pain now, that he had buried and avoided. Don't cry. Never cry. For them. So, he didn't. But he looked out the windscreen, over the roof of the station, and into the black gulf of the sky.
Did I do good, Eve? Did I do good?
Ash came back to the car and handed Scott his phone. "Here you go," she said, a somber tone to her voice.
Thanks, Chatterbox. Is everything all good?
"Yeah, it's fine. But hey, I gotta go in soon." She crossed both her fingers and gave that nervous whisper yell of excitement. "Wish me luck," Scott said in that reassuring way.
Honey, you'll be fantastic.
She smiled and disappeared into the station. Scott tuned to its respective frequency and waited. He reasoned that the Golden Oldies Country Power Hour was worth sitting through if his daughter was on after it. The minutes flew into an hour, and still, Ash wasn't on the air. He went to check his watch, but then it happened. Scott's phone chirped with an incoming call. He dug into his pocket and fished it out.
Scott Campbell speaking.
Mr. Campbell?
Came the voice on the other end.
Speaking.
There was a staticky silence as the man on the other end tried his best to talk about something he wasn't prepared for.
Mr. Campbell, it's your son. I'm sorry to be the one to have to tell you this, but there's been an accident. Are you able to come by the hospital?
Scott looked to the station, and then to the phone. His heart was jumping in his chest.
Yes, of course. Which one?
Scott hurried into the station and found Ash. She was sitting just outside the booth, idiot grin on her face and mere minutes from going on. That was the last time he saw her smile like that. They sat in the car outside the hospital, both knowing what was inside, but neither ready to face it. Scott felt the weight of everything on him.
First Eve, now Joey.
He thought. Life was a cruel, cruel bitch to the Campbell family.
Okay, you ready to go in?
His voice cracked as he said it. Ash said nothing. Then he heard it. Under her breath, almost like a prayer, she muttered, "Don't think about it. Don't think about it. Don't think about it." Covering her hands over her ears. He felt something twinge inside, but he wasn't his son. Scott just squeezed her shoulder and said,
Chatterbox, it's okay, sweetie. You don't have to see him.
Scott felt numb, icy, as he got out of the car and went to the morgue, alone. 5. Reaping the seeds you sow. Scott always wondered if it was his fault. Not what happened to Eve, not what happened to Joey, but rather, Ash. She never saw him at the morgue, and Scott told her it was all right. She never saw him at the wake, and Scott told her it was all right. And finally, she couldn't bring herself to see him into the ground. And Scott, well, had trouble with that. With each day that passed, his joints got stiffer and his bones more brittle. The dizzy spells were just a daily occurrence now. But all Scott could think about were two things. Could he bring himself to tell her? And would she leave him without a goodbye? Just like Joey. It wasn't fair on her to think that. But as mortality dawned on him, Scott Campbell wanted more than air. To finally open his heart and talk to someone, let all his pain go flooding out. He didn't cry for Eve for the sake of the kids, and he didn't cry for Joey for the sake of Ash. But now, those emotions, that tar, was drowning him. They were sat at the dinner table, shyly poking at supermarket chicken with their forks, saying nothing, only the most recent of dinners like this since what happened to Joey. Car accident, that's what they called it. A freak tragedy of bad luck. Wrong place, wrong time, they said. I'm so sorry for your loss, they said. There was some other driver. They turned a corner too fast and then, bang, that was it. Lights out for Joseph Campbell. Just like that. If life had taught Scott anything, it was that. Despite what you think as a kid, human beings are extraordinarily fragile. Anyone, for any reason, could drop at any second. It's my fault, Ash squeaked. Scott looked up from his chicken.
What are you talking about, sweetie? Of course it wasn't.
I called him, she said, not crying, rather staring in awe at her perceived crime. I took your phone, and I asked to come and see me after the broadcast, that I was sorry for the way that I am, and that I just wanted him to be happy. She looked up at Scott, who had to look away so as not to break his tears rule. I just wanted him to be proud of me, Daddy. I just wanted him to love me. Scott, the father who was always full of advice and guidance, couldn't find any words. Wouldn't have been driving if it wasn't for me. She looked back down at her plate. Wouldn't have been driving. Scott stood and left to his room without saying a word. Ash left the table too and shuffled to Joey's old room. She dusted off his many nerdy bits and pieces, all the things he had abandoned in the pursuit of being a grown-up, until finally she got to his movie shelf. She slid Die Hard into the VCR, put her hands over her ears, Don't think about it. And began chanting Don't again. Think about it. Don't think about it. As tears ran down her face. But life wasn't finished with the Campbells. Next came the long sleep. Scott didn't leave his room the following morning. Ash thought that was fair, as she had labeled herself as her brother's murderer. But then came the next morning, and the next. When she opened his bedroom door to see he had not touched the food and water she had left him at the threshold, she panicked and made the call. Hyperventilating and clawing at his unconscious body, she wailed into the phone. Please come help! My daddy, he won't get up! When they got to the hospital, and Scott was wheeled away by a team of men in white smocks, another man, a doctor, her dad's doctor, sat her down and asked,
So I take it you know what this means?
She didn't, and he explained. It was a wall of white noise. It's strange how everything becomes out of focus when tragedy hits. Tragedy, something Ash was all too familiar with now, but entirely unequipped to deal with. Words like terminal and days floated into her ears. The doctor grabbed her hand.
But you will wake before then, my dear, I promise.
Shrill beeping and a cold, blinding light were what Scott woke to. He was scared. He felt weak. He felt like a little kid who forgot where they fell asleep and awoke in fear. But as the shrill beeping matched his own terror, and as he felt the cold air through his thin gown, he knew where he was. He was going to die. Jesus, fuck, he was going to die. It was all so real to him now. His eyes darted about frantically until they finally settled on the figure sitting next to him.
Chatterbox.
A wave of relief hit him as he reached out a hand to his baby girl. But an unfamiliar voice came back.
It's all right, sir. You're in the hospital.
A nurse. Just a nurse. He tried to sit up, weak against the cables. He looked around the room for his little chatterbox, his one life raft in the storm. He wanted to tell her so much, but mostly he just wanted to be held. But he was alone. Everything bore down on him. Reality and understanding. The cold, uncaring truth. Scott sank defeated back into the bed, all his pain bubbling inside. Eve had left him. Joey had left him. And now, even his sweet, dorky ray of sunshine, his chatterbox had left him too. He was alone.
Ash?
Came a whimper. Then finally, voice cracking, Scott Campbell cried. On the long-distance bus carrying far away to God knows where, Ash was crying too. Her thigh was bruised from how many times she had punched it. "I made a mistake," she said, but she couldn't turn back. Samson Shire held nothing for her but sadness, an ocean of it. So even though it made her loathe her very being, Ash ran away, because that was all she knew how to do. Whether it was her mother's face, her brother's body, or her father's deathbed, Ash could only turn away, because ignorance is bliss.
Before I head off today, I want to give an absolutely massive thank you to my beautiful, glorious patrons, Lady Nevermore, Scott Queen, Catherine Gordon, The Curator, and Stephen Stevens.